moment that shook America. What if I told you that 3 seconds, just three, could expose everything America tries to hide? What if I told you that in a silent federal courtroom, under bright lights and colder stares, a black woman stood alone, and in the space between a raised hand and a breaking point, the truth of this country was revealed? Imagine standing at a podium, speaking facts that could save lives, and suddenly a uniformed officer walks toward you, his jaw clenched. His anger was sharp enough to cut through marble. Imagine feeling the sting of his hand crashing across your face in front of judges, cameras, in a nation that has always asked black women to be strong, but never safe. And imagine choosing in that moment, not fear, not silence, but courage. The kind of courage that can shatter systems, rewrite laws, and shake the ground beneath those who misuse power. This is the story of how one woman's calm, controlled, devastating act of self-defense didn't just knock a corrupt officer to the floor, it knocked open the door to national accountability. It is a story of pain, of injustice, of truth presented in the face of brutality, and of a country forced to ask itself, how many times must a black woman bleed before America believes her? How many times must she stand alone before we finally stand with her? If you think you know what happened in that courtroom, you don't, not yet. And once you hear the full truth, you will never see justice, policing, or power the same way again. This story will challenge you. It will move you. It will open your eyes, and it might just break your heart before it puts it back together. So before we begin, hit subscribe to the Racial Truth channel. Stay with us, learn with us, stand with us. Because what you're about to witness is more than a story. It is a reckoning. It is a lesson. It is a mirror. And it is a call to help build a safer, kinder, more united America. Starting now. The slap heard in Atlanta. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta rose out of the morning haze like a marble monument to promises America had made, but never quite kept. On this Tuesday, its steps overflowed with protesters, some carrying signs demanding police accountability, others waving blue-striped flags insisting officers were under attack. Voices collided in the thick Georgia air, but inside the courthouse, the tension felt sharper, quieter, like the stretch of silence before a thunderstorm cracks open the sky. Courtroom 6B was filled past capacity. Journalists packed the back rows, angling cameras for any sign of conflict. Families whose sons and daughters had been hurt by police sat shoulder to shoulder with city officials and retired officers. And at the front, at a modest wooden podium, stood Maya Johnson, 40 years old, her charcoal gray suit pressed with military precision. Her presence drew no attention from most observers. She wore no jewelry beyond simple stud earrings. No congressional pin glinted on her lapel. She carried herself not with the swagger of an elected official, but with the quiet steadiness of someone more familiar with deserts and deployment zones than marble chambers. Few in the room knew she was a U.S. Congresswoman. Even fewer knew she was a Marine veteran who had led platoons through enemy fire. And almost no one knew what she was willing to endure to tell the truth. Judge Linda Chavez, silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, adjusted her glasses as she surveyed the courtroom. Her eyes paused briefly on one man standing rigidly by the side door. Officer Kyle Brennan, 38, uniform immaculate, jaw tight enough to crack teeth. He had been assigned to courthouse security for the week, a last-minute reassignment from his regular Atlanta Police Department unit. Officially, it was a temporary promotion. Unofficially, it was a disciplinary relocation, one that the department hoped the public wouldn't notice. Judge Chavez nodded toward Maya. "You may proceed, Ms. Johnson." Maya clicked the remote in her hand. Behind her, a large screen lit up with charts, graphs, and maps. Neighborhoods are shaded in deep blues and aggressive reds. Arrest rates, use of force incidents, complaint statistics. In the last 3 years, she began, her voice soft but carrying with unmistakable clarity, excessive force complaints in majority black neighborhoods within Atlanta have increased by 43%. A murmur rippled through the gallery, the kind that comes when numbers cease to be abstract and start sounding like wounds. Standing in his assigned position, Kyle Brennan's shoulders tensed. He narrowed his eyes at Maya, studying the way she spoke. Calm, measured, professional. She didn't tremble, didn't rush, didn't seem intimidated by the 100 eyes staring at her. Something about her composure irritated him deeply. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms, feeling heat rise beneath his collar. "You people always come in with numbers," he muttered under his breath. "Never been on the streets a day in your lives?" Maya continued, unaware, or simply unmoved, by his growing hostility. "We see clear patterns in the data," she said as the slides changed. "Certain tactical units demonstrate significantly higher rates of civilian complaints and disproportionate targeting of Black residents. This suggests systemic issues rather than isolated incidents." Phone cameras lifted subtly. Journalists leaned in. Kyle felt the first sting of shame, which quickly soured into defensiveness. He had heard this narrative too many times. Activists twisting statistics, painting officers as villains, ignoring the danger cops face daily. He reminded himself of his grandfather, a uniformed icon in family photos. His father wounded in a shootout. His younger brother killed in the line of duty only 2 years earlier. He carried their legacy. He protected their memory. He knew what real danger looked like. And to him, this woman at the podium, she was nothing more than a threat to everything he believed in. Maya clicked to the next slide. The screen darkened momentarily before an image materialized. A face, a familiar one. Officer Kyle Brennan, Atlanta Police Department, his official portrait, his record beneath it. 7 years of civilian complaints, neatly itemized. Excessive force, racial profiling, improper arrest, unauthorized search. The courtroom air thickened until it felt hard to breathe. Kyle's face went red, first with disbelief, then with anger. His jaw twitched visibly. The gallery turned toward him with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and discomfort. "That's enough," he muttered, then louder. "That's taken out of context." Judge Chavez lifted her gavel. Officer Brennan remained silent, but her voice barely reached him through the roar in his ears. Maya clicked again, and this time the courtroom watched him move. Grainy body cam footage filled the screen. Kyle yanking a Black teenager out of a car, though the teen's hands were clearly raised. The boy's voice cracked as he stammered that he hadn't done anything wrong. Kyle slammed him against the hood anyway. The screen displayed the resulting medical report: wrist fracture, facial bruising, concussion symptoms, gasps. One woman covered her mouth. A man whispered, "Jesus, that's not what happened," Kyle hissed, breathing hard. "I wasn't. She's twisting this." The footage changed. A Hispanic woman was crying because she couldn't understand Kyle's rapid English commands. He grabbed her arm harshly. Another clip, his voice crackling over the radio. 3 Black males, usual suspects doing usual suspect things. Another, driving while Black. Let's see what we can find. Between each clip, Maya narrated with the calmness of someone committed not to punishment, but to truth. Kyle clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles blanched. Rage built in him. Not a sudden wildfire, but a slow, suffocating burn that had been igniting for days. Each slide chipped at his pride. Each statistic felt like an accusation against his family legacy. Each gasp from the audience felt like judgment. Maya did not glance at him once, and that, more than the evidence, more than the videos, more than anything, sent him over the edge, because she didn't even see him as dangerous enough to fear. She saw him as irrelevant. The final slide appeared, a still frame from a body cam video. A young Black father in his car, hands on the wheel, speaking respectfully. His daughter is visible in the back seat, holding a stuffed giraffe. "Exhibit 24, Maya said. Body cam footage demonstrating planted evidence." Kyle inhaled sharply, but the room was already falling silent, bracing for impact. The footage rolled. There he was, Kyle, walking around the vehicle. Pausing, he reached into his pocket, palming a baggie, dropping it onto the passenger seat. The father's voice shook. "Officer, I don't know what that is. Sir, please, my daughter..." The little girl is crying. The father is handcuffed. His life is crumbling in real time. When the video ended, the room felt hollowed out, stripped to bone. Kyle's world imploded all at once. He didn't hear Maya say, This arrest resulted in an innocent man spending 18 months in prison. He didn't hear the collective gasp. He didn't hear Judge Chavez calling for order. All he heard was his own breath, shallow, ragged, suffocating. All he felt was humiliation, sharp enough to be pain. All he saw was Maya's calm, unwavering posture. His boots moved before he made the decision to move, before thought could intervene, before consequences could exist. He stormed toward the podium, marble echoing beneath each furious step. "No!" he shouted, voice cracking with desperation. "You don't get to do this. You come in here with your lies, your agenda, your numbers." Maya did not flinch. She did not raise her hands. She did not even step back. Her stillness enraged him beyond reason. "Officer Brennan, stop!" Judge Chavez shouted, rising to her feet. He didn't hear her. "You think you can ruin good cops? You think you can ruin me?" Kyle screamed. He reached the podium in 4 strides, and before anyone could intervene, his hand flew. The slap crashed across Maya's face with a sound so violent it silenced every witness. Her head snapped sharply to the side. Her glasses flew off, skidding across the marble. The room gasped as one organism. Maya slowly straightened. Her fingers trembled, but only for a second as she lifted her glasses. She placed them back onto her face with deliberate care. Then she looked directly at Kyle Brennan. Something in her eyes changed. Something ancient. Something forged in war, in injustice, in the long suffering of generations. Her spine lengthened. Her stance widened. Her breath settled into something cold and devastatingly calm. Kyle raised his hand for another strike. And that was the final mistake he would make. In 3 controlled seconds, Maya Johnson moved with precision that bordered on poetry. 1, she caught his wrist midair, stopping the blow as if she had predicted its path. 2, she stepped in, delivering a palm strike to his solar plexus that emptied his lungs. 3, she followed with an elbow to the jaw, a clean, efficient, disabling technique. Kyle's consciousness blinked out before he hit the floor. He collapsed in a heap of blue fabric and dead weight. Screams erupted across the courtroom. Phones surged upward. Cameras zoomed in. Judge Chavez pounded her gavel in vain. Maya did not gloat. She did not shake. She did not apologize. She stood over the fallen officer, breathing evenly, the sting on her cheek already swelling into a bruise. And in that moment, before the backlash, before the national outrage, before the trial that would shake the country, there was only the truth. A black woman had been struck. She defended herself, and the world watched an officer fall to the marble floor because he believed she had no right to stand tall in the first place. This was the moment everything changed. For Kyle, for Maya, for Atlanta, for America. A reminder of a painful truth. When ignored pain finally rises, it does not whisper. It defends itself. And when it does, the world is forced to listen. Truck 2 lives, 2 Americas. There is a particular silence that follows the collapse of a man who believed he would never fall. It is not peaceful. It is not solemn. It is the silence of a wound splitting open. As Officer Kyle Brennan lay unconscious on the marble floor, that silence echoed in ways the cameras could not capture. And while the world would soon replay the knockout thousands of times, what they wouldn't see, not yet, were the roads that led Maya Johnson and Kyle Brennan to that single devastating intersection. To understand the explosion, you must first understand the fuse. Maya Johnson, built from fire. Long before she stood at the podium in Atlanta, Maya had stood in places far more dangerous. She grew up on the South Side, one of those neighborhoods glossed over in tourist brochures, known for its soul food diners and also for the sirens that sang the city to sleep. Her father was a warehouse worker who believed in hard work, even when hard work did not believe in him. Her mother was a nurse who stitched together both wounds and dignity in a system that treated black women as if they were built to endure pain. Maya grew up learning 2 contradictory truths. 1, America could be brutal. 2, and yet America could be beautiful. The push and pull of those truths shaped her early life. She was 12 when she watched an officer shove her cousin against a patrol car for matching a description. Her cousin was 14, straight A student, honor roll boy with dreams bigger than his zip code. She remembered his voice, thin, cracking, saying, "Ma'am, I didn't do anything." She remembered the officer laughing. She remembered her cousin shaking for days afterward. That moment didn't make Maya bitter. It made her determined. When she turned 18, she enlisted in the Marines. Not because she wanted to fight a foreign enemy, but because she wanted to learn discipline, leadership, and courage in a country that too often denied those traits to girls who looked like her. Boot camp stripped her down. Combat built her back up. 2 tours overseas followed. She carried wounded men through sandstorms, stood guard under a burning sun, and learned that fear was not something to eradicate, but something to walk with. When she dragged her injured sergeant from a collapsing structure under enemy fire, she didn't think about medals. She thought about survival, responsibility, duty. The Bronze Star came later, when she was stateside and still flinching at fireworks. But something else came too, a quiet, burning conviction. If I can face bullets abroad, I can face injustice at home. So she ran for Congress. She won. And then she did what many promised, but few delivered. She started listening. Not the kind of listening politicians do for cameras, the kind that requires presence, humility, and courage. She visited families who had lost sons to traffic stops. She talked to mothers who avoided calling 911 because they feared it more than the danger outside. She listened to teenagers who felt doomed before adulthood. She listened to officers, good ones, who whispered about colleagues they feared, systems they couldn't change, and silence they resented. Every file she presented in that courtroom had passed through her hands many nights after midnight, when her office was dark and her heart was heavy. And every time she turned a page, she thought, if someone had protected these people earlier, they would have never become case studies. That was Maya Johnson, not a politician trying to score points, not an activist seeking attention, a woman who had seen too much suffering, both abroad and at home, to pretend silence was safety. Kyle Brennan, built from ghosts. To understand Kyle's rage, you must understand his ghosts. Kyle Brennan came from a long line of men in blue. His grandfather's photograph hung in the living room, sepia-toned, uniform, crisp, a look of stern determination on his face. He had walked Atlanta's streets during the 60s when racial tensions were fire-hot and officers were celebrated for being tough. Kyle's father had been tougher still. He became a detective, the kind who believed rules were guidelines and keeping the streets safe meant doing what you had to do. When he took a bullet in 1995, the family turned him into a symbol. Sacrifice, bravery, the Brennan badge legacy. But the real ghost that shaped Kyle was his younger brother. 2 years before Maya walked into that courtroom, his brother had been killed during a nighttime robbery call. He died in Kyle's arms, blood pooling into the cracks of a convenience store floor. Nothing shatters a man like watching someone he loves die while wearing the same badge that he too carries. Kyle never healed from that loss. He armored himself instead. He told himself there were 2 kinds of people in the world, those who obey and those who cause trouble. He told himself that black men who ran were guilty. The Hispanic women who hesitated were hiding something. That children who cried were manipulative. That young fathers in cars were the usual suspects. When you carry unresolved grief, everyone starts to look like the enemy. Officer Brennan didn't set out to become what he became. He simply never questioned it. His supervisors backed him. His union shielded him. Internal affairs closed files with a signature and a sigh. Courts dismissed complaints for lack of sufficient evidence. The system whispered to him, "You're right. You're justified. You're untouchable." So he believed it. Every shove of a teenager, every slammed car door, every planted baggie. They were all moments where accountability should have stepped in, but didn't. That silence shaped him. That silence built him. That silence emboldened him. Until Maya Johnson brought the noise. The courtroom collision, where stories collided. So when Maya stood at that podium, calm, articulate, unyielding, showing the world the receipts of his actions, she wasn't just presenting evidence. She was unraveling his mythology, his legacy, his grief, his sense of identity. Because Kyle Brennan had spent 15 years believing he was protecting America. And here was this woman saying he was harming it. In his mind, she was not exposing misconduct. She was desecrating a sacred family lineage. She was tearing down the last thing he had left. And each video, each statistic, each recorded slur was a mirror shoved violently in front of him. Kyle had never been forced to look at himself in full light. But Maya wasn't just holding a mirror. She was holding the truth. And truth is a terrifying thing when your entire sense of self depends on avoiding it. The audience saw Maya presenting evidence. Kyle saw her dismantling him. The audience saw data. Kyle saw betrayal. The audience saw injustice being exposed. Kyle saw attack, humiliation, annihilation. It is easy to say he should have controlled himself. It is harder to understand the desperation of a man whose entire identity is collapsing publicly. But desperation does not excuse harm. Pain does not justify violence. Fear does not give you the right to strike someone trying to protect others. And racism? Racism will always find a reason to strike. Maya's stillness. The weight behind it. When Kyle stormed the podium on day 5 of testimony, Maya's stillness wasn't born of arrogance, nor was it born of naivete. It was born of exhaustion. The exhaustion of a black woman who had spent her entire life being shouted over, talked down to, dismissed, and underestimated. It was born of clarity. Clarity that comes from seeing rage before it arrives, recognizing its shape, its language, its temperature. It was born of survival. The kind you learn not in books, but in neighborhoods where officers like Kyle patrol with more aggression than understanding. She did not flinch when he called her, "You people." She had heard that tone her whole life. She recognized the venom behind it. She did not step back when he charged. She had stared down worse threats. Threats that carried rifles instead of badges. She did not tremble when he raised his hand. She had been struck before. By life. By injustice. By the world. Maya's stillness was not weakness. It was a strength learned the hard way. And when he slapped her, that violent crack echoing through the courtroom, the pain that shot through her cheek was not just physical, it was ancestral. It was generational. It was historical. The hand of one man carried the weight of a system, and the system believed it had the right to put her in her place. But Maya Johnson did not exist to be placed anywhere, except where truth demanded. Lessons in collision. Humanistic value. When two lives collide, one shaped by privilege that never questioned itself, and one shaped by struggle that refused to bow, there is always damage. But inside that damage, there is also a lesson. Kyle's life teaches us what happens when power goes unexamined, when grief turns inward, when bias becomes policy, when silence covers wrongdoing like soil over a seed. Maya's life teaches us what happens when courage grows through pain, when service becomes purpose, when truth refuses to be buried, and when dignity stands taller than fear. Their collision is not just about them, it is about us. Two Americas stood on the marble floor of that courtroom, one clinging to authority without accountability, the other demands justice without apology. The lesson is not that one must fall and the other must rise. The lesson is that a nation cannot survive if one America brutalizes the other. We rise only when we rise together. And sometimes before unity, the truth must break through the silence. Loud enough for the whole world to hear. 5 days of slow violence. Violence doesn't always begin with a fist. Sometimes it begins with a statistic, a whisper on a police radio, a look that lasts a second too long, a silence that excuses harm again and again. Long before Officer Kyle Brennan charged the podium, long before the slap that split open the country's conscience, there were 5 days inside Atlanta's federal courthouse that dragged every buried truth to the surface. 5 days when the world watched the slow-motion unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long. 5 days when Maya Johnson stood against not just one officer, but an entire culture of denial. 5 days when slow violence, quiet, systematic, sanctioned, was finally confronted in a room that could no longer pretend not to hear. Day 1, the numbers that cut through the room. The first day began without fire. No shouting, no chaos, no fists, just numbers. Excessive force complaints in majority black neighborhoods have risen 43% over 3 years, Maya said, her pointer gliding smoothly over a map of Atlanta's south and west sides. Her voice was calm, clinical, but the numbers were not. Rows of reporters shifted, scribbling notes. Community leaders in the front row exchanged glances, some weary, some relieved that someone, finally, was saying this in a federal courtroom. Kyle Brennan, standing rigid near the door, felt heat rise behind his ears. He knew this map. He had patrolled most of these neighborhoods. He had drawn his weapon on these streets. He had ended his shifts with adrenaline still tearing through his blood, convinced he was the thin barrier between order and chaos. But Maya's tone, steady, unshaken, made him feel as if she was accusing him of something deeper. Not just misconduct, hypocrisy, blindness, harm. He clenched his jaw until the muscles fluttered. Maya continued, flipping through slides detailing complaint patterns, demographic disparities, and use of force spikes. We see concentration of incidents disproportionately affecting Black residents, she said softly. These patterns hold regardless of crime rates. The room stirred. It was subtle, but it was the first crack in Kyle's armor. Not because the data was unfamiliar, he had heard it before, but because this time the room was listening. The silence felt like judgment. Day 2, when numbers turned into faces. If day 1 was about statistics, day 2 was about people. Maya presented case files, wounds, injuries, families permanently altered. She processed them like a surgeon, unsentimental, precise, but with a quiet compassion threading through every word. A teenage boy slammed against a hood. A young mother was bruised during a misunderstanding. A pastor was shoved during a traffic stop. Each case included timestamps, reports, and injury photos. Each case belonged to someone who looked like Maya, someone who lived in the neighborhood she grew up in. Kyle stood watch, chest rising and falling with barely contained tension. He muttered under his breath, too low for anyone except his own conscience. They don't know what it's like out there. They never show what happened before the camera turned on. He imagined tapping Maya on the shoulder and telling her to stop, to look at arrest from his point of view, to understand fear, to understand duty, to understand loss. But duty without introspection becomes abuse. Fear without accountability becomes bias. Loss without healing becomes rage. He didn't understand that yet. Day 3, when the room heard his voice. On day 3, Maya queued up a series of audio recordings. Grainy police radio chatter filled the courtroom speakers. Static, sirens in the background, officers responding to a robbery. Then Kyle's voice emerged. Units responding. 3 black males. Usual suspects doing usual suspect things. A collective inhale swept the courtroom. Kyle's face flushed deep red. That's not, he sputtered quietly to himself. Maya let the recording play uninterrupted. Another clip crackled through the speakers. Another driving while black. Let's see what we can find. Some people gasped. Others muttered in disgust. Judge Chavez looked toward Kyle with an expression that carried both disappointment and the practiced neutrality of a woman who had presided over too many cases like this. Kyle's fists tightened. The metal buttons on his uniform shimmered under the lights as his breath grew unsteady. He whispered, "She's twisting this. I wasn't talking about race, it's just cop talk, stress talk." But the words in the recording were not ambiguous. They carried weight, tone, and intention, and the courtroom heard them clearly. This was the day Kyle first lost control. "Your Honor," he said, unable to hold it in, "this is being taken completely out of context." Judge Chavez raised her gavel sharply. "Officer Brennan, you must remain silent. This is your final warning." Maya, for the first time, glanced at him, not with anger, not with contempt, but with a look that said, "I see a man who is breaking, but I cannot protect you from the truth." Kyle saw it as judgment, and something deep inside him snapped tighter. Day 4, denial stripped bare. By the 4th day, the courtroom was electric. News crews filled every hallway. Protesters outside grew louder, carrying signs with slogans that clashed violently in ideology, but shared the same space. Protect Black lives. Stop demonizing cops. Truth is not treason. Inside, Maya presented charts showing that Kyle's APD unit conducted traffic stops in Black neighborhoods at 340% above their demographic share. The numbers were brutal, mathematically undeniable, morally devastating. Maya elaborated, arrest-to-conviction ratios show low evidence thresholds. This suggests stops may be based on bias rather than legitimate suspicion. Kyle could not hold still. That's because that's where the crime is, he blurted. Half the courtroom gasped. Judge Chavez slammed her gavel. Officer Brennan, you are out of order. She's twisting data, he shouted. She's making us look racist. Remove him from the courtroom if he interrupts again, Judge Chavez warned the bailiff. Kyle swallowed hard. His face burned with humiliation, so fierce it bordered on pain. He raised his hands in surrender, jaw trembling. I'll control myself, Your Honor, he said through clenched teeth. But the control was temporary, a thin veneer over a boiling pot. Maya continued as if nothing had happened. Her calmness was the match to Kyle's gasoline-soaked pride, and every slide, every calmly spoken fact felt to him like a personal attack. Not on his job, not on his decisions, but on his identity. Day 5, when truth became a weapon. Day 5 was the day the world stopped pretending. The courtroom was overflowing, standing room only. Reporters lined the walls, cameras perched like vultures waiting for what they sensed was coming. Maya approached the podium with the same steady cadence she had maintained all week, though exhaustion pooled beneath her eyes. She knew the weight of what she was about to present, knew the danger in exposing misconduct so egregious that the world couldn't ignore it. Exhibit 24, she announced, body cam footage demonstrating fabricated evidence. Kyle felt the world narrow to a tunnel. He knew what was coming. He had spent the night trying to will the footage out of existence. The video played. The young father's hands trembled on the steering wheel. License and registration, sir, Kyle said in the recording. Yes, officer. Reaching now, the man replied, moving slowly, respectfully. Kyle circled the car, reached into his pocket, pulled out a baggie, dropped it onto the passenger seat. The father's voice cracked. I don't know what that is. Please, sir, I swear, my daughter. The little girl's screams pierced the courtroom. When the video ended, the room was stunned into a suffocating silence. Then outrage erupted. How could he? He put that man in prison. That's a child crying. Judge Chavez pounded her gavel. Order, order! Kyle's vision blurred. His breath turned shallow. Shame and anger and fear collided violently inside him. He muttered, This is wrong. She shouldn't have. How did she? But no one was listening to him anymore. Everyone was listening to Maya. Everyone was seeing the truth. When she stated calmly, this fabricated arrest resulted in an innocent man serving 18 months in prison, Kyle's last thread of composure snapped. His hands curled into fists. His throat constricted. His face burned with the rage of a man whose entire world had just been exposed. He no longer saw evidence. He saw betrayal. He no longer saw Maya. He saw an enemy he believed had no right to confront him, no right to challenge him, no right to undermine the sacred uniform he wore. So he stepped forward. Then again. The bailiff shouted. Reporters scrambled. Every camera turned toward him. Kyle's boots struck the marble like thunder. His breathing was a growl. You think you can do this? You think you can destroy me? He screamed. Maya didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show fear. It enraged him further. You don't know what it's like. You never faced a gang member. You never held your dying partner in your arms. But pain does not justify cruelty, and grief does not excuse violence. Kyle reached her. His hand rose. And fate began counting to 3. The humanistic heart. What those 5 days teach us. These 5 days were not just a prelude to a courtroom assault. They were a diagnosis of a system that had taught officers like Kyle Brennan that accountability was optional and scrutiny was betrayal. A diagnosis of a society that often demands silence from the marginalized and patience from the oppressed. A diagnosis of a nation where truth must shout to be heard over the noise of denial. Maya did not expose Kyle to punish him. She exposed the truth to protect others. Kyle did not attack Maya because she was wrong. He attacked her because she was right. And the world would soon learn that when truth threatens those accustomed to unchecked power, violence often follows. But the deeper lesson beneath those 5 days is this. Racism doesn't erupt suddenly. It builds slowly, tolerated by silence, strengthened by excuses, shielded by systems. Slow violence always becomes fast violence in the end. What happened that week in Atlanta was not a coincidence. It was the inevitable collision of two Americas. One demanding accountability, the other demands obedience, and only one of them could survive unchanged. Calculated courage. The night before, everything exploded in courtroom 6B. Atlanta hummed with a restless unease, as if the city itself knew something dangerous was gathering strength beneath its surface. News vans crowded the sidewalks outside the courthouse. Protesters on both sides lit candles, chanting into the dusk. And high above the noise, in a quiet hotel room overlooking the city lights, Maya Johnson sat alone at her desk. Her glasses rested on a stack of folders. Too many stories, too many lives, too much pain condensed into paper. A desk lamp cast a soft cone of light across her notes, turning the manila pages gold at the edges. She should have been sleeping. But sleep had become a luxury she forfeited long ago. Her phone buzzed. Lauren Kim, her chief of staff, appeared on the screen. "Maya, we need to talk," Lauren said without preamble. Her voice was sharp, trembling with the kind of fear that only rises when logic and instinct collide. Maya leaned back, pressing two fingers to her temple. "Tell me, we pulled new security footage from today." Lauren exhaled shakily. Officer Brennan was caught in the hallway, pacing for nearly 15 minutes, talking to himself, clenching and unclenching his fists. "He's spiraling, Maya." Maya closed her eyes, listening. She wasn't surprised. She had seen the way Kyle watched her, like her words were knives carving into the world he depended on, like her calm was an insult, like her evidence was betrayal. Lauren continued, "Maybe you should reveal who you are tomorrow. Tell them you're a congresswoman. If he knows he's not dealing with just an expert witness, maybe he won't." "Won't what?" Maya asked softly. "Won't snap," Lauren whispered. Silence hovered, heavy, thick, real. Maya stood and walked to the window. Downtown Atlanta shimmered beneath her. Cars crawled along Peachtree Street. Neon signs flickered. For a moment she imagined her younger self, little Maya from the South Side, looking up at this view, dreaming of a world where justice wasn't a privilege. She took a slow breath, letting the memories settle. "If I reveal my title," she said quietly, "people will say Officer Brennan lost control because he recognized an elected official. They'll say it was about politics, not about who he thought I was." Lauren swallowed audibly. "And who does he think you are?" Maya stared at her reflection in the window. Tired eyes, a bruise still faintly visible on her cheek from the earlier confrontation, strength hidden beneath exhaustion. "He thinks I'm a black woman overstepping my place," she said. "He thinks I'm someone he can intimidate, someone small, someone powerless." Lauren's voice trembled. "But you're not powerless." "No," Maya whispered, "but he doesn't know that. And that's exactly why this evidence means something." She turned back toward her desk, the folders stacked like gravestones. "I need the world to see how he treats me when he thinks I'm just another black woman challenging his authority. If I announce I'm a congresswoman, the mask goes back on. He becomes polite, careful, controlled. And without the mask," Lauren said slowly, "we see the system for what it really is," Maya finished. The line went quiet for a long moment. Lauren finally asked, voice tight with fear, "But what if he snaps tomorrow?" Maya lowered herself into the chair. She had asked herself that question too many times to count over the past week. She had studied security protocols, revisited her martial arts training, even practiced her posture in the mirror. Stance wide, center steady, breath controlled. She whispered, "Then the world will see what happens when officers believe they can intimidate someone who looks like me." Lauren's breathing grew uneven. "You're playing with fire." Maya glanced at the photo of her teenage daughter taped inside her planner. A smiling girl holding a soccer ball. The photo was 2 years old, the smile slightly outgrown now, but still visible in pieces. "Lauren," she said, "we've lived in the fire for generations." Fear and preparation. The quiet battles. After hanging up, Maya stretched her aching neck. The weight of the week sat on her shoulders like armor she never removed. She rubbed the faint bruise on her cheek from Kyle's earlier outburst, more symbolic than painful, a reminder of how quickly dignity can be struck aside. She opened her laptop and pulled up federal courtroom security guidelines. She read them for the third time. Officers always remain armed. Witnesses have limited space to retreat. Bailiffs intervene only after a threat becomes obvious. Her stomach tightened. She moved to the mirror, studying her stance. Years ago, she had been famous among her Marine unit, a captain who could disarm a man twice her size in under 5 seconds. But that was then. She had not trained in real combat in 3 years. Her life was now briefings and hearings, not battlegrounds. She raised her hands slowly, practicing the defensive blocks she once performed effortlessly. Her movements were stiff at first, then smoother, then almost instinctive. But doubt lingered like a shadow at her side. What if I'm not fast enough now? What if my timing is off? What if he outweighs me and I can't get free? Fear didn't frighten her. She understood it. She respected it. It made her careful. She whispered to herself, "Preparation prevents panic. Training beats fear." But this wasn't just about physical danger. It was about moral danger. The danger of allowing the truth to be softened, masked, and hidden behind polite decorum. Maya returned to her desk and began writing notes for the next day's testimony. As she wrote, she heard her mother's voice in her memory, gentle but firm. "Baby, you don't get to choose the battles that come to your doorstep. You only get to choose how you walk into them." Maya took another breath. The city lights outside flickered like a constellation of past and future hopes. She whispered into the quiet room, "I'm walking in." The message from home. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text. "Mom, please be careful tomorrow. I saw the news. That officer looks dangerous." She chuckled softly. Even at 17, her daughter still called her mom with that mixture of love and worry. Maya typed back, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Mom knows how to handle bullies." She stared at the screen for several seconds before adding, "I love you." She didn't tell her daughter the truth, that Kyle Brennan outweighed her by nearly 80 pounds, that officers received hand-to-hand combat training annually. The courtroom layout left her little space to evade an attack. That fear was a steady pulse in her chest tonight. She would not burden her daughter with that. Maya placed the phone face down and closed her eyes. She thought of the families she had met, mothers whose sons never came home, children who developed a fear of uniforms before they learned to spell police. She thought of all the people who trusted her to hold the line for them. That responsibility was heavier than any Marine pack she had carried overseas. A strategic decision and the risk behind it. Lauren called once more before midnight. "Maya, one more thing," she said breathlessly. "Should we notify the networks to prepare crews early tomorrow?" Maya hesitated for the first time that evening. Bringing cameras meant risk of misinterpretation, risk of sensationalism, but it also meant truth would have witnesses. "Make sure every major network has someone there," Maya said finally. "If something happens, I want the world to see it. All of it." Lauren inhaled sharply. "Okay, but..." "Maya?" "Yes? Promise me you'll be careful." Maya's voice softened. "I'll be prepared." She ended the call. Then she sat in silence, realizing something that made her chest tighten. She was preparing to face a man who might lose control. She was preparing to defend herself physically in a federal courtroom. She was preparing for violence, not because she sought it, but because she knew how America reacted when a black woman spoke uncomfortable truths with unwavering confidence. It was not her strength that threatened men like Kyle Brennan. It was her composure, her certainty, her refusal to bend. And the world had punished black women for that kind of power for centuries. The humanistic heart. Why this matters tonight, Maya wasn't just a congresswoman or a veteran or an expert witness. She was the embodiment of a difficult truth. Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it is a slow erosion of dignity, of safety, of humanity. And resisting that erosion requires more than evidence. It requires courage powerful enough to walk into danger, with truth as your only protection. Maya was terrified, But she believed in something greater than her fear. She believed in accountability. She believed in justice. She believed in the power of exposure, of bringing darkness into light. Most of all, she believed in her community, in a future where no officer would dare treat a black woman the way Kyle Brennan treated her, because accountability was no longer optional. That belief steadied her hands. The dawn before the storm. When Maya finally lay down to rest, the digital clock glowed 2:07 a.m. She closed her eyes, replaying her strategy, her training, her mission. She did not know that the next morning would become a national reckoning. She did not know millions of people would soon watch her every movement in slow motion. She did not know her life and the country would change forever before noon. But she sensed something coming, something inevitable, something long overdue. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, one truth settled deep in her spirit. When injustice pushes hard enough, courage must push back. And sometimes courage takes the form of a single woman standing alone in a courtroom, refusing to be silent. From hero to defendant. The video of Maya Johnson's 3-second takedown struck the internet like lightning. By the time the paramedics had rolled Officer Kyle Brennan off the courtroom floor, the clip had already begun its wildfire spread. Within 2 hours, it hit 1 million views. Within 6, it dominated national headlines. Within 12, it divided the entire country. Some called Maya a hero. Others called her a disgrace. Everyone had an opinion, but few knew the truth. Not yet. The morning after, a nation-shake sunrise over Atlanta usually brought a quiet glow, warm and hopeful. But the day after the incident, the morning light revealed something else entirely. A city in a country on the edge. Protesters doubled overnight. Police barricades rose around the courthouse. News vans lined the sidewalks like armored vehicles. Reporters shouted questions at anyone walking inside. Should a congresswoman be allowed to knock out a police officer? Is this self-defense or anti-police violence? Did race play a factor? Is this the beginning of a new civil rights moment? Inside courtroom 6B, the marble floor had already been polished where Kyle had fallen. But some stains don't come off with cleaning. Some echoes linger. And by mid-morning, the country had found itself a new battlefield. Public perception. A charging decision that shocked the country. At 10:15 a.m., District Attorney Eric Daniels stepped before a wall of cameras on the courthouse steps. His suit was immaculate. His hair was perfectly combed. His expression was carved from solemn ambition. He cleared his throat. "Good morning," he began, gripping the podium as though steadying himself. "After reviewing the footage of yesterday's incident, my office has decided to file charges against Congresswoman Maya Johnson." Gasps rippled through the crowd, including assault and battery on a police officer, assault on a federal employee, and disorderly conduct within a federal courthouse. In the silence that followed, even the protest chants outside seemed to falter. Daniels continued, playing a heavily edited version of the viral video, one that conveniently began after Kyle slapped Maya. It showed only the 3 defensive strikes that knocked him unconscious. "As you can see," Daniels said gravely, "Congresswoman Johnson responded with military-level force. Officer Brennan appears to have attempted a standard restraint technique, placing a hand near her shoulder, an action within typical protocol when tensions escalate." The crowd bristled. Maya's supporters shouted, "Play the full video!" Others murmured, uneasy but unsure whom to believe. Daniels pressed on. Given her specialized combat training, her hands legally qualify as deadly weapons. The phrase hung in the air like poison. Hands as weapons. Her body as a threat. Her training as a criminal. Her self-defense was considered assault. A black woman was once again being punished not only for surviving violence, but for refusing to be a silent victim. The media machine, a war of narratives. By sunset, the country split into 2 aggressive narratives. Narrative 1, Maya the monster. Conservative outlets ran headlines like, "Congresswoman attacks officer in courtroom melee." "Is military training too dangerous for politicians?" Johnson's violent outburst raises questions about emotional stability. Kyle appeared on one evening show wearing a neck brace, moving slowly, his voice wavering with carefully rehearsed fragility. "I was just trying to restore order," he said softly. I touched her shoulder gently, hoping to guide her away from the microphone. Then, Everything went black. He paused as if collecting himself. My children are scared, he whispered. They saw the video of their father being attacked. I'm just trying to figure out how to explain to them why a leader of this country hurt me. Sympathetic nods filled the studio. Not one host asked about the slap. Not one asked about the planted evidence. Not one asked about the racial slurs recorded on his radio. In the eyes of many, he was reborn overnight, not as a man whose misconduct had destroyed lives, but as the victim of a violent, ungrateful congresswoman. Narrative 2. Maya the Martyr. On the other side of the media spectrum, people rewound the full video again and again. They saw the slap clearly. They saw her not retaliate but prepare. They saw a black woman defend herself with precision, not vengeance. Social media erupted. Your stand with Maya, Yarka, self-defense, is not a crime. Narm, believe black women activists marched downtown chanting, she stood for the truth. Now we stand for her. Women of color shared stories of times they had been threatened, silenced, struck, and told to stay calm, only to be punished when they defended themselves. Veterans honored her restraint. Legal scholars praised her proportionality. Survivors of police abuse saw themselves in her steadiness. But divisions deepened. Friends turned against friends. Families argued over dinner tables. America once again fractured along the familiar fault lines of race, gender, power, and justice. Political abandonment. Inside the Capitol, Maya's colleagues watched the chaos unfold with growing discomfort. Privately, many admired her. Publicly, they distanced themselves. One senior congressman whispered to another, "We can't be seen supporting violence against police, not now, not with re-election season around the corner." Some carefully crafted statements were released. We believe in due process. We urge Congresswoman Johnson to cooperate fully with investigators. We must condemn all violence regardless of the source. Not a single statement mentioned Kyle's slap. Not a single statement mentioned the planted evidence. Not a single statement mentioned the racial slurs. Because those truths were messy, risky, politically inconvenient, and convenience often wins over courage. Even the police reform bill Maya had spent years building, now near the finish line, was suddenly placed on hold pending the outcome of legal proceedings. For the first time in years, Maya found herself politically alone. Maya under siege. In her office, Maya sat surrounded by stacks of letters, threats, flowers, and messages of support, a chaotic mosaic of love and hatred. Her daughter's voice cracked during their evening call. "Mom, are you going to jail?" Maya swallowed hard. "No, sweetheart, I didn't do anything wrong. But they're saying—" "I know what they're saying," Maya whispered, "but the truth doesn't bend just because someone shouts louder." When she hung up, she allowed herself a moment of quiet despair. Not fear, not regret, just grief. The kind that comes when you stand up for justice and watch the world twist your bravery into wrongdoing. Lauren Kim entered the room, her face drawn with stress. "Your approval ratings dropped 20 points today," she said. "Some people already think you should resign." Maya closed her eyes briefly. She had endured gunfire overseas. She had carried wounded Marines through explosions. She had faced far worse than this. But betrayal, the betrayal of supposedly principled colleagues, cut deeper than shrapnel. Lauren hesitated before adding, "The DA, he's pushing this hard. He wants a conviction. He sees you as a stepping stone to a higher office." Maya exhaled slowly. Her voice was steady, even gentle. "Power protects power, Lauren. Truth threatens power. That's why this is happening." The police unions strike back. The Atlanta Police Union held a rally outside Maya's district office the next morning. Officers in uniform filled the street. Their signs read, "Blue Lives Matter. Resign, Maya Johnson. She attacked all officers." Union President Tom Richards stood atop a makeshift podium and roared into a megaphone. "First, they attack our funding. Then they attack our honor. Now they attack our bodies. Congresswoman Johnson represents everything wrong with this anti-police movement." Cheers erupted. None of them acknowledged the video of Kyle planting drugs. None acknowledged the child screaming in the back seat. None acknowledged the years of complaints. because acknowledging that would require confronting a truth too uncomfortable for many. Accountability is not anti-police. Silence is. The system's plot thickens. The prosecutor's strategy. Back at the DA's office, Eric Daniels reviewed his strategy with a team of young attorneys. He pointed to a still frame frozen on a screen. Kyle falling backward, Maya's elbow extended. This, he said, is what wins elections. He wasn't talking about justice. He wasn't talking about the truth. He was talking about optics, about power. We frame her as unstable, he continued, military trained, overreacted, could have killed him. But sir, a junior attorney said timidly, the unedited video clearly shows. Daniels cut him off sharply. Juries don't see context, they see emotion. And right now, police are struggling nationwide. This case gives us a chance to shift public sympathy. He clicked to another slide. Officer Brennan is cooperating fully. He'll testify he only touched her shoulder. Silence. No one dared question the strategy again. Maya's quiet resolve. Late that night, Maya stood alone on her balcony, staring out over Atlanta's cityscape. The lights shimmered like fragile hope against the dark. The wind carried distant protest chants, some for her, some against her. She crossed her arms tightly, grounding herself. She had not become a Marine because she enjoyed fighting. She had not become a congresswoman because she enjoyed politics. She had chosen both paths because she believed in service. Service rooted in dignity, equality, and protection. Now the country wanted to criminalize her for defending herself. But she knew something the DA, the union, the media, and her critics didn't understand. A woman who has survived war does not crumble under lies. A black woman who has survived America does not surrender to injustice. The truth was on her side. She only needed to bring it into the light. She whispered into the night, a promise, a vow. I will not let them rewrite this story, not mine, not his victims, not our communities. The humanistic heart. Why this moment matters. This chapter of Maya's life wasn't just about charges or politics. It was about something deeper, something painful and necessary. When a black woman shows strength, the world often calls it violence. When a white officer shows violence, the world often calls it strength. This is the divide Maya walked into. This is the truth she exposed. This is the burden she carried. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been punished for refusing to be small. Her story teaches a lesson America still struggles to learn. Accountability is not anti-police. Truth is not betrayal. Self-defense is not aggression. Courage is not violence. And love, real love for our nation, our communities, our people, demands honesty, not silence. The trial of truth. The federal courthouse in Atlanta had seen its share of historic trials, governors, CEOs, politicians, but nothing prepared it for United States versus Congresswoman Maya Johnson. By the time jury selection began, the building was surrounded by barricades, camera towers, and converging rivers of protesters. Some held up signs that read, "Self-defense is not a crime." Others countered with, "No one is above the law." The nation watched, breathless, as if justice itself were on trial. Inside, courtroom 6B felt smaller now, as though the walls were being pushed inward by the weight of expectation, resentment, and hope. Every seat was filled. Reporters squeezed together like sardines. Officers lined the walls. Federal agents watched from the corners. And at the defense table, alone, no legal team, no entourage, no shield, sat Maya Johnson. She wore a navy suit. Her face was calm. Her posture is straight. Her heart is steady. She had made a choice that stunned even her closest allies. She would defend herself. Not because she distrusted lawyers. Not because she believed she was invincible, but because she understood something crucial. A black woman defending her own body must also defend her own truth, and only she could tell that truth with the weight it deserved. Jury selection, America in 12 seats. The jurors who filed into the box represented a fragile microcosm of the country. 6 white jurors, 3 men and 3 women. 4 black jurors, 2 elders, 2 millennials, 2 Hispanic jurors, both mothers, Their eyes flickered between Maya and the prosecution table where Kyle Brennan sat. Upright in his uniform, his jaw still bruised, his expression carefully crafted into wounded sincerity. To some jurors, he looked like an officer wronged. To others, he looked like a man who had finally met a boundary he could not break. Judge Linda Chavez addressed the room with the grave tone of someone who knew history was watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "this case is not about politics. It is not about media narratives. It is about determining whether Congresswoman Johnson committed assault or acted in lawful self-defense." But everyone knew it was about far more. It was about race, power, fear, the right of a black woman to defend herself against state violence. It was the kind of trial that carved itself into textbooks. Opening statements. 2 stories, 1 fight prosecution. A story of dangerous force. District Attorney Eric Daniels approached the jury with confidence that bordered on smugness. He wore a dark suit, red tie, and the smile of a man who believed he had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began softly, "this case seems complicated, but it is profoundly simple." He clicked a remote. On the screen behind him, the viral clip played in slow motion, starting from the moment Maya struck Kyle. The slap was absent. The escalation was erased. Just 3 seconds of Maya's precision. When Officer Brennan attempted a standard restraint, Daniel said, Ms. Johnson responded with military-level violence. She used her combat training ordinary citizens do not have, to knock him unconscious. She could have killed him. He paused dramatically, letting the words sink in. This was not self-defense. This was excessive force. This was assault. Several jurors looked uneasy. The power of selective evidence doing what it always does, shaping doubt. Daniels folded his hands. "Congresswoman Johnson is a leader. Leaders must be held to the highest standard. Police officers cannot become targets for politicians who disagree with them. The law applies equally to everyone." He returned to his seat wearing victory like an expensive cologne. Defense. Maya's truth, quiet but unbreakable. Maya rose. No theatrics, no multimedia displays, no entourage, just a woman alone with the truth. She approached the jury slowly, letting her presence settle like a grounding breath. "Members of the jury," she began, "I did not strike Officer Brennan because of who he is. I struck him because of what he did." She held their gaze with a steadiness that could cut glass. "You will see the full video, not an edited clip, not a convenient angle. You will see him slap me with enough force to knock my glasses off my face in a federal courtroom. You will see him raise his hand again, this time with the intent to strike harder, and you will see me defend myself using the minimum force necessary to stop an ongoing assault." She paused. "I could have broken his ribs. I could have shattered his jaw. Military training teaches us how to end threats permanently." She let that sink in, not as intimidation, but as truth. "But I didn't. I disabled him just enough to protect myself, nothing more." She stepped closer to the jury box. "This case is not about my training. It is about my humanity, my right, not as a congresswoman, not as a Marine, but as a black woman who was struck in court and refused to collapse for the comfort of others." A hush rolled across the room. "When you watch the full truth," she said softly, "I trust you will see what justice requires." She sat down, and for the first time Daniel's smile faltered. The prosecution's case, the mask of innocence. Officer Kyle Brennan takes the stand. Kyle walked slowly to the witness stand, still milking the stiffness left from his injury. He adjusted the microphone with a trembling hand. Several jurors leaned in sympathetically. "Officer Brennan," Daniels began gently, "please tell the jury what happened that day." Kyle nodded, adopting a humble, wounded expression. "I was providing security," he said, voice quivering slightly. "Ms. Johnson was presenting inflammatory statements about police officers. When she became agitated, I approached her to de-escalate." Daniels nodded encouragingly. "How did you attempt to de-escalate?" "I placed a hand near her shoulder," Kyle said. "A routine gesture, gentle, never meant to harm her." He swallowed hard. "Next thing I knew, I was on the floor, unconscious. It felt like being hit by a professional fighter." This was the moment media headlines were built for. A uniformed white officer describes being attacked by a black congresswoman. It was crafted for impact, designed for sympathy, delivered with precision. Daniels then brought in a medical expert who dramatically described Kyle's mild concussion, neck strain, and potential long-term cognitive effects. Never mind the fact that Kyle had needed nothing stronger than over-the-counter painkillers. Never mind the fact that he had filmed the interviews hours later. The theater worked. Several jurors shifted, anxious. Daniels rested his case with quiet satisfaction. The cross-examination. Truth sharper than a blade. Maya stood, the courtroom tensed. She approached Kyle with the measured calm of someone who had calculated every step before taking it. "Officer Brennan," she began softly, "you testified that you touched my shoulder gently." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "May we look at the footage together?" She signaled to the technician. The full, unedited video played on the monitors. Kyle's hand whipped across Maya's face with unmistakable force. Her glasses flew. The sound cracked like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Several jurors recoiled. Maya turned back to Kyle. "Officer Brennan," she asked quietly, "does that look gentle to you?" Kyle stuttered. The camera angle." "Ah." Maya tilted her head slightly. "The camera angle." She let the words sit. Then she struck. "Officer Brennan, how many excessive force complaints have been filed against you during your 15-year career?" Daniels shot to his feet. "Objection! Irrelevant!" Judge Chavez lifted a hand. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer." Kyle's face drained of color. "A few," he said. Maya opened a folder. 47, she corrected gently. 47 complaints. 12 sustained by internal affairs." The room erupted. Kyle's jaw tightened. "Those were misunderstandings. Like the time you slammed a teenager against a car door, breaking his wrist?" Maya asked, pulling up video evidence. Kyle's breathing grew ragged. "That suspect resisted." The video clearly showed the teen with his hands up. Gasps again. "Like the Hispanic woman you grabbed because she didn't understand English fast enough?" Maya continued. Kyle's eyes darted desperately toward Daniels. "Or," Maya said softly, "the father whose life you ruined when you planted evidence in his vehicle?" Daniels leapt up. "Objection." "Overruled," Judge Chavez said. "Answer the question." Kyle's composure was shattered. He looked like a man drowning. Maya stepped closer. Her voice became soft, almost compassionate. "Officer Brennan, isn't it true that you attacked me because you could not tolerate a black woman presenting evidence of your misconduct?" Kyle exploded. "You people always make it about race," he screamed. "You get your positions because of affirmative action, not because you deserve them." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Daniels closed his eyes in defeat. Jurors stared at Kyle in stunned silence. Maya nodded slowly. No further questions. With that single meltdown, the mask Kyle had worn for years, raceless, blameless, righteous, crumbled in front of the entire nation. Maya takes the stand. A masterclass in truth. When Maya testified, the courtroom shifted. It felt like the air itself leaned forward to listen. She began. "I served 2 tours overseas. I have faced enemy fire. I have watched friends die. But nothing prepares you for the violence that comes dressed in a badge when that badge believes it is untouchable." Her voice carried the weight of memory, war zones, trauma, and long nights studying case files from communities that looked like hers. "On the day Officer Brennan struck me, I did not see a uniform. I saw a raised hand, a familiar threat, a message black women have been given for generations: stay silent or be punished." She demonstrated her defensive moves in slow motion, explaining how each strike was designed to neutralize, not injure. "I used the minimum force necessary," she said. "If I wanted to harm him, I would have. But I didn't, because my goal was not vengeance. It was survival." Daniels tried to rattle her. "Is it true," he demanded, "that your hands are registered as deadly weapons?" Maya lifted her chin. "No, they are registered as my own, and I reserve the right to use them when someone attacks me." A ripple of awe spread across the courtroom. Her testimony was not just a defense, it was a revelation. Closing arguments. 2 Americas collide. Daniels' closing argument. Fear disguised as law. Daniel's appeal to fear. If we allow this kind of violence in our courtrooms, where will it end? Officers risk their lives every day. We must protect them from aggression, even from elected officials. His message was clear: obedience over truth, authority over accountability. Maya's closing argument: truth without apology. Maya rose slowly. "Members of the jury," she said, "this case asks you a simple question. Does a black woman have the right to defend herself against violence?" Silence. A silence that bore witness. She continued, "If justice is real, it protects the vulnerable, not the powerful who abuse their authority. If equality is real, it belongs to every race, every gender, every person." She walked toward the jury box, voice soft but unwavering. "Officer Brennan attacked me because he thought I was powerless. He thought I was a voice he could silence with his hand. Today, you decide whether he was right." She let her words settle. Choose justice. Choose truth. Choose a safer America. One where violence is not protected by a badge. The verdict: history in 12 heartbeats. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 17 minutes. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood. "On the charge of assault and battery, we find the defendant not guilty." A gasp, then a cry, then applause that grew into thunder. Tears blurred Maya's vision, but she did not crumble. She stood tall, shoulders squared, dignity intact. Truth had won. And for the first time in a long time, America felt a shift. Small but real. A shift toward accountability, toward justice, toward humanity. Humanistic heart. Why this trial matters. This trial was never about one officer and one congresswoman. It was about who is allowed to be safe in America, who is allowed to defend themselves, whose pain matters, whose truth is believed. Maya's victory was not just her own. It was a victory for every black woman who had been struck, silenced, dismissed, for every community harmed by unchecked authority, for every American who dreams of a nation where justice does not bend to power. The trial taught us, justice is not a luxury, it is a responsibility. One we must share, one we must protect, together. Justice, finally, and the cost. The courthouse steps erupted the moment Maya Johnson walked through the double doors, the Georgia sun blazing behind her like a coronation. Supporters lifted signs, reporters surged forward. Strangers shouted her name with a fervor usually reserved for icons, not congresswomen accused of assault just days earlier. "Justice served! Self-defense is not a crime! We love you, Maya!" Some cried openly, releasing years of pent-up frustration, finally given voice through Maya's victory. Others held their children tightly, pointing to her as an example of courage made flesh. But Maya didn't raise her fist triumphantly. She didn't cheer or celebrate. She stepped forward with the same quiet dignity she had carried through every day of the trial. Her face was calm, composed, but her eyes glistened with something deep: relief, exhaustion, and an ache that only truth-tellers ever feel. When she approached the microphones, she did not speak as a victor. She spoke as a witness. Today proves that no one is above the law, not officers, not politicians, and no one, regardless of race or gender, is below the law's protection. The crowd roared, but Maya wasn't finished. What happened in that courtroom was not just about me. It was about every person who has ever been told their pain doesn't matter. Every person who has been silenced, slapped, or dismissed. Every person who has been afraid to defend themselves because they knew the world might defend their attacker instead. Her voice thickened, but she did not waver. We cannot build a safer America by protecting misconduct. We build a safer America by holding each other accountable, with fairness, compassion, and honesty. Her words washed over the crowd like a cleansing wind. And then, after one last steady breath, she walked away from the podium, embraced by supporters while cameras caught every angle. The country watched the image again and again, Maya standing with her head high, lifting truth without bitterness or vengeance. The fall of a badge once protected. While Maya's triumph filled the headlines, another story unfolded in the shadows. The swift and brutal collapse of Kyle Brennan's life. It began the very afternoon of the verdict. Immediate termination. The Atlanta Police Department issued a terse statement. Officer Brennan has been terminated for conduct unbecoming, violation of federal civil rights protections, and misuse of authority. There was no ceremony, no farewell, no handshake. His badge, once the pride of 3 generations, was dropped into a cardboard box, cold, disposable, forgotten. Union abandonment, the union that once paraded him as a symbol of officers under attack, quietly withdrew support after his racist outburst in court aired on national television. His private chat logs leaked. The slurs, the threats, the admissions that he planned to shut that woman down. The public sympathy he had cultivated evaporated overnight. Federal civil rights charges. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice opened a formal investigation. Charges followed: civil rights violations, evidence tampering, false arrest, misuse of authority, and like dominoes finally given permission to fall, every arrest Kyle had made over 15 years came under review. Dozens of wrongfully convicted men, mostly black, emerged with lawyers by their sides. They wanted justice. They wanted accountability. They wanted the truth to matter. The same truth Maya had revealed. The personal collapse. The hardest fall, though, came from Kyle's own family. His wife filed for divorce, citing emotional volatility and irreparable public humiliation. His children wouldn't return his calls. His home went into foreclosure. Job applications went unanswered. Google results became a lifelong sentence. In prison, inmates replayed the knockout clip on communal TV sets, calling it the slap heard around the world. The 3-second justice. And Kyle, who once believed he was untouchable, finally understood what Maya meant when she said, "No one is above the law." But understanding came too late. The rise of a movement. While Kyle's world disintegrated, Maya's exploded into something far larger than personal vindication. The country had seen the slap, the knockout, the trial, the truth. They had seen a black woman defend herself and win, and people felt something shift inside them, something old, something deep, something righteous. Approval ratings surge. Within a week, Maya's approval rating skyrocketed to 84%, the highest of any freshman congresswoman in decades. People didn't just admire her, they trusted her, because she had shown them who she was under the harshest pressure. Calm, principled, unbreakable. The Hayes Justice Act Congress, embarrassed by how quickly they had abandoned her, scrambled to amend their mistake. They not only apologized, they revived her police reform bill, and this time it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The Hayes Justice Act included mandatory body cameras for all federal officers, independent oversight boards with subpoena power, automatic review for officers with repeated complaints, a national misconduct database, federal penalties for evidence tampering. It was the most significant policing reform in a generation, and it bore Maya's fingerprints all over it. The president signed it on the White House lawn, placing his hand on her shoulder as cameras flashed. "This nation is better today because Congresswoman Johnson refused to be silent," he said. The crowd erupted. Millions watching at home felt a swell of pride they hadn't felt in years. Hope, real hope, did not feel naive anymore. A global impact. The story didn't stop in America. Across the world, security forces studied Maya's courtroom takedown as a case in professional restraint and defensive precision. International agencies adopted versions of the Brennan Protocol: verify before confrontation, use force only with a clear threat. Women's self-defense enrollment rose 400%. Social media is filled with stories of survivors finding courage. Governments examined their own law enforcement systems. Maya's name became a symbol, not of violence, but of justified defense, measured power, and moral clarity. A new beginning for her family. Through all the noise, the global attention, the political chaos, Maya remained grounded in the one thing that kept her sane: her daughter. When Maya returned home to her district for the first time after the verdict, her daughter ran into her arms, crying with relief. "I knew you didn't do anything wrong," she whispered into Maya's shoulder. Maya held her tightly, tighter than she had allowed herself to imagine during the trial. Later, standing in their kitchen, her daughter asked, "Mom, Are you proud of what you did? Maya looked into her eyes filled with fear and admiration and possibility. I'm proud, Maya said softly, that I didn't let fear decide who I am. The girl smiled, then whispered something Maya would never forget. I want to be brave like you. The costs no one sees yet. For all the victories, Maya bore scars the public could not see. She still woke some nights hearing the echo of Kyle's slap. She still replayed the moment his hand rose a second time. She still carried the weight of the people whose stories she had used to expose the truth. Courage has a price, justice has a cost, and even triumph can feel heavy. But Maya accepted that weight. She carried it the way she carried her Marine pack years ago. Not because it was light, but because it was necessary. The humanistic heart, why this moment matters. Part 7 is not just about consequences. It is about transformation. Personal, national, moral. It teaches us. Racism thrives in silence. Justice thrives in truth. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing dignity despite fear. Accountability heals nations. And love for community, for fairness, for humanity is the force that rebuilds America. Kyle's downfall was not a punishment. It was a correction, a long overdue acknowledgement of the harm he had inflicted under the guise of authority. Maya's rise was not a reward. It was recognition of service, of sacrifice, of truth spoken when truth was dangerous. Together, their stories form a painful but essential lesson. America becomes stronger not by hiding injustice, but by confronting it. Not by fearing one another, but by caring for one another. Not by division, but by accountability, compassion, and unity. This is the real victory, not the verdict, not the legislation, but the shift in the nation's heart towards something better, something braver, something more human, a stronger America. Legacy and lesson. 2 years passed, but the sound of that slap inside courtroom 6B, followed by the 3 seconds that changed a nation, still echoed across America, across oceans, across institutions that once believed themselves immune to accountability. People didn't just remember the moment, they studied it, they taught it, they built entire reforms around it. And in a country hungry for honesty, Maya Johnson's story became more than a headline. It became a blueprint for courage, for truth, for justice, for love. A nation transformed by 3 seconds after the Hayes Justice Act reshaped national policing standards, the ripple effects spread farther than anyone predicted. Police misconduct fell dramatically. Major cities reported a 67% drop in misconduct complaints, not because officers suddenly became perfect, but because oversight became real. Body cameras were no longer optional. Internal investigations could no longer be buried. Patterns of abuse could no longer be ignored. The system had eyes now, real eyes, not the ones that used to look away. Courtroom violence, declined incidents involving officers and civilians inside courthouses dropped by 78%. Why? Because officers are now trained under a new federal guideline known worldwide as the Brennan Protocol. A global reminder of what happens when someone confronts without understanding, when authority moves before verifying, and when power assumes instead of asking. The irony of naming it after the officer who triggered its creation wasn't lost on anyone, but history has a way of remembering the lesson, even when delivered by the wrong teacher. A culture of verification, not assumption security agencies, across Europe, Asia, and South America adopted new identification procedures modeled after the Atlanta case. Tokyo implemented the Verify Then Act mandate. London's Metropolitan Police introduced mandatory bias checks during field encounters. Berlin's government buildings adopted assumption audits, evaluations of how and why officers initiate confrontations. Globally, mistaken identity confrontations dropped nearly 90%. A courtroom slap in Atlanta changed the world. The human stories behind the shift statistics are powerful, but the soul of change lives in people. Maria, 28, the security officer. I used to panic when people yelled at me on duty, she said in an interview, but when I saw how calm Maya was under attack, I realized composure is strength. Now I train others to breathe first, act second. David, 35. The mall guard. When two men argued in the food court, old me would have rushed in shouting. New me asked, "Are you both safe?" That simple question de-escalated everything. I learned that from studying Maya's case. Ashley, 19, Academy cadet. She fought back without cruelty. That changed me. I joined the academy because I want to be the kind of officer who brings dignity into every encounter, not fear. Thousands of women self-defense classes across the country are filled with women of color. Not to learn how to fight, but to learn how to survive, how to stand, how to refuse erasure. I'm not training to attack anyone, one participant said. I'm training so I don't feel powerless ever again. These stories weren't just testimonials. There was evidence that human dignity, when defended, becomes contagious. Kyle Brennan. The lesson of consequences. 4 years into his federal sentence, Kyle spent most days in the prison library helping other inmates with paperwork, appeals, and legal forms. It was the only job where people didn't flinch when he approached. Now and then, a new inmate would recognize him. "Hey, aren't you the cop from that video?" Kyle would nod weakly, shame pressing into every line of his face. The slap hurt around the world, some would joke. He never laughed. The truth had humbled him in ways punishment never could. He finally understood the cost of assumptions, how a single moment of unchecked prejudice could unravel a lifetime. In a rare interview he gave near the end of his sentence, Kyle said quietly, "I destroyed my life because I thought authority made me right. I thought I knew who I was dealing with. I didn't. And now I live every day remembering the people I hurt because I refused to learn." His words became part of police academy ethics training nationwide. Sometimes the harshest teachers are those who have lived the consequences. Maya's new role, leading with quiet power. Congresswoman Maya Johnson did not seek celebrity. She did not seek revenge. She did not seek to capitalize on the moment that made her a household name. She sought change, real change, lasting change, and she got it. Chairwoman of the Civil Rights Subcommittee. Her colleagues, once fearful of her controversy, now fought for a seat at her policy table. She authored 23 pieces of landmark legislation in 4 years: criminal justice reform, mandatory de-escalation training, data transparency across law enforcement, protection for whistleblowers, expansion of civil rights enforcement. Her leadership wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy. It was rooted in the steadiness she displayed the day she stood unmoving before an enraged officer. "Courage is quiet," she often said, "and quiet courage changes the world." Maya's daughter, a legacy continued. Her daughter graduated valedictorian and enrolled in the Naval Academy. Reporters asked her, "Are you following in your mother's footsteps?" She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I'm following the footsteps of justice. If that leads me where she went, I'm okay with that." The world saw in her the next chapter of a legacy born from pain, but cemented in purpose. The Zara Hayes Leadership Institutes, a new generation of protectors across 31 American cities, institutes named after Maya, script originally used Zara Hayes, began teaching situational awareness, de-escalation, emotional intelligence, constitutional civics, bias recognition, ethics in authority roles. Students learned not how to overpower others, but how to protect them. Not how to confront, but how to communicate. Not how to dominate, but how to serve. One slogan adorned every classroom wall: "Power is the privilege to protect, not to harm." Maya visited these institutes regularly, speaking with survivors, activists, officers, and students. Each visit deepened her conviction that transformation does not begin in legislation. It begins in people. A nation remade by accountability. 2 years after the slap, the President of the United States addressed a crowd gathered on the steps of the Capitol for what would become a new national observance, National Verification Day. A day dedicated to ending assumptions, honoring truth, and promoting dignity in authority. "Assumptions have broken families," he said. "Misjudgments have taken lives. But today we honor a different path, the path shown to us by Congresswoman Maya Johnson, who reminded us that courage is not in striking others, but in standing firm for justice, even when the world trembles. Maya stood beside him, not as a symbol, not as a victim, but as a leader. The crowd roared her name, but she felt none of the ego that fame normally brought. She felt gratitude, responsibility, hope, the humanistic heart. Why the story matters. Part 8 is not just an ending, it is an invitation. This story, her story, reminds us, racism withers when confronted by truth. Courage spreads when one person chooses to stand firm. Love becomes stronger when people protect each other. Accountability is not punishment, it is respect. A better America is not built by pointing fingers, but by joining hands. Maya's journey is a testament to what happens when one person refuses to shrink in the face of injustice, when one person believes that dignity is not negotiable, when one person chooses love, not the soft love of comfort, but the hard love of truth, because truth is love, and love, real love, transforms nations. A final message to the nation. On the second anniversary of the slap, Maya recorded a message that played on screens across the country. We are not defined by the moments that break us, but by the moments that build us. When you face injustice, stand tall. When you face hatred, choose dignity. And when you face fear, remember that courage is contagious. Let's build an America where no one needs to fear those sworn to protect them, and where we protect one another because we choose compassion over cruelty and truth over silence. We rise together, always together. The legacy. A viral video of 3 seconds of self-defense once shocked the world. Now it inspires it. A slap meant to silence a Black woman became the spark that reshaped policing, restored accountability, and rekindled the nation's hope. A moment of violence became a movement of humanity, and Maya Johnson, calm, steadfast, unbreakable, proved one enduring truth. America becomes stronger when we choose justice. We become safer when we choose kindness. The lesson we carry forward. In the end, Maya Johnson's story is not just a story about a courtroom, a slap, or even a trial. It is a story about us, about a nation learning, stumbling, struggling, and rising towards something better. It reminds us that justice isn't an institution. It isn't a building. It isn't a badge or a title. Justice lives in the choices we make every single day. How we speak to one another. How do we protect one another? How we choose to see one another, with dignity or with prejudice. Maya's resilience teaches us this truth. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to let hatred decide who you are. Her story asks us to build a country where we verify before we judge. We listen before we act. We stand up for one another, not only when it is safe, but when it is right. We choose compassion over cruelty, even when cruelty feels easier. We defend what is sacred, dignity, humanity, and the right of every person to feel safe. Because a stronger America doesn't begin with laws. It begins with love. It begins with us, with our willingness to protect, uplift, and believe in one another, across race, across background, across every line meant to divide us. And if Maya's journey shows us anything, it's that one act of courage can transform a nation, and that every single one of us carries that same power inside. So as you leave this story, carry its lesson with you. Reject racism, embrace humanity, stand for truth, and let love guide your actions. This is how we build a safer America, a kinder America, a better America, together. Call to action if this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, if it stirred something deep in your heart, then join our mission. Hit that subscribe button to the Racial Truth Channel. Become part of a community committed to justice, empathy, and real change. And don't stop here. Visit the Racial Truth Channel and watch more powerful stories that reveal truth, heal division, and inspire unity. Together we rise. Together we learn. Together we build a stronger America, one story at a time.